Hello and welcome again to MWCC Community College and our continuing dialogue with local author Ray Carey about his book, Democratic Capitalism, The Way to a World of Peace and Plenty. Hello again, Ray.
Hi, Mike.
Today we're going to be continuing our conversation regarding another one of your hypotheses. Truth-seeking is a team sport. By that, Ray, do you mean that sometimes people get together and work as a group and make deliberate decisions to not seek truth or not seek the answer?
No, I'm borrowing that from one of Francis Bacon's three specific advice on how to find truth. But let me back up for a minute.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, in my study, I fell in love with the 18th century Enlightenment. And if you think when Voltaire picked that name, that was during his first trip to the Bastille. The mind was not free at that time. This was only a century after Galileo ended his life in house arrest. We'll forget Bruno, who burned at the stake.
Right.
Descartes wasn't able to publish until after his death. I think people are familiar with all of those sad events. But Voltaire was a very brash guy. He got out of the Bastille, had his new name, and some noble, gave him a hard time about his new name, and Voltaire responded with something like, having a new name is better than disgracing an old name, and the noble had him beaten up by thugs and banished to England. Best thing that ever happened to him. In his years in England, around 1726, next few years, he discovered the incredible works of Newton, Locke, Bacon, and he discovered the level of freedom then going on in England with their constitutional freedom. So Voltaire can get a fair amount of the credit for bringing all of that extraordinary knowledge back to the continent with him. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, that then progressed through to Condorcet as the last of that group. But they were incredible people. Kant, for example, never left Königsberg in Prussia, as far as I know, but he was famous for his perpetual peace and his analysis of the thought process. Mm-hmm. But they were making huge use of the printed word. They'd get a book in a hurry and they'd absolutely consume it. And he got a book by David Hume, Adam Smith's best friend, on why you have to integrate experience and instinct with the reasoning process. And Hume was so excited about that that he called it his Copernican revolution.
His Copernican revolution, wonderful, marvelous.
Within his own work. But the Enlightenment just learned from Voltaire about Bacon, and one of them, D'Alembert, who was a famous mathematician. All of them were scientists of one type or another. D'Alembert commented on Lord Bacon. He said that the head should be placed the immortal Chancellor of England, Francis Bacon, whose work, so justly esteemed, deserve our study even more than our praise. I think there's an extremely important point there. Here is this famous mathematician, famous among other things for the D'Alembert principle, and please don't ask me what that was. But this was a brilliant man, and no chauvinism. He's getting Lord Bacon was a slightly disgraced politician. He left his job as Lord Chancellor because his political enemies were able to prove that he had taken gifts which were a little touch too big for the nature of the discussion. But he went to work on his process of truth-seeking, and he impressed people like scientists on the continent to use it in their Enlightenment work. He preceded them by a century and a half. And he started out saying the primary notion of things which the mind imbibes and accumulates are false, confused, and over hastily abstracted from the facts. Whence it follows that the entire fabric of human reason which we employ in the inquisition of nature, is badly put together and built up like some magnificent structure without any foundation. So he
Marvelous quote.
So he said, we need a process that is dynamic to begin with. In other words, it amuses me that every generation a new group of people discover that there are no absolute truths, that the senses are fallible, and the mind is culturally conditioned. There are no absolute truths. I mean, we've known that since Zeno and the pre-Socratic skeptics.
For our viewers who are struggling with this notion of truth is a team sport, how do we know truth? Is it where you find it? This Enlightenment period was filled with wonderful advances in philosophy and science, but at the same time, the harsh contradiction of people losing their lives over the truth that they found. And at the same time, here later on, we look back and discover that the world isn't flat, to use a colloquialism, huh?
Yes.
And so how do we recognize it today? How do we know today who the Voltaires or the Copernicans around us? How do we know that today? How can we?
It's a very good question, and that is another theme of my work.